Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. Today I need to cut some big pieces of plywood on my DeWalt 1030 round arm radial arm saw. Now this is a very nice saw. It's not the biggest saw. It's got a rip capacity of about 26 inches. However, this piece of 1/4 inch plywood that I just cut on it, I cut to 33 3/8 inches wide. So how did I cut this wide piece of plywood on this saw? Well, I didn't break any laws of physics, I just used them to my advantage. In this case, what I did is I clamped a straight edge onto the piece of plywood and then ran it along the front edge of the table, making the cut. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to see how to set this saw up so that way we can clamp a straight edge onto any piece of wood we want and guide it through the saw, making a straight cut. Now this is a big deal. Not so much for cutting square things like this, but say you have a piece of plywood where there are no straight edges on it at all. Each edge is wavy. You can't reference any of those edges off the fence because it's just going to make another wavy cut, or worse, if the workpiece twists a little bit, it could kick back. Well, what you can do is do exactly what we're going to do in this video, clamp a straight edge to it and use the front edge of the table as the guide. And then it doesn't matter how wavy the other edge is because the resulting cut is as straight as that piece of wood that you clamped onto it. So, let's set this thing up for the in-rip position, and then we'll see how to figure out the placement of the straight edge, and we will cut some big pieces of plywood on a not so big radial arm saw. I want to get this thing set up in the in-rip position. So the first thing I want to do is crank up the blade so that way it's out of the kerf of the table, and I can go ahead and unclamp the yoke. Now I can go ahead and spin the saw so that way the blade is closest to the column and the motor is farthest away from the column. And then I'll lock the yoke clamp back into place. If there's any question as to whether this thing dropped down into its hole, you can always just give it a little bit of a wiggle to make sure it's fully seated. It's a tapered pin in a tapered hole, so it will wedge itself down in there eventually. With that set up, I now need to move the fence as far back as I can. On this saw, the table clamps are in the rear, so I will just loosen those up. Take the fence out and move it to the back. Now if your saw has table clamps with enough threads in them, you can even get rid of the fence altogether for this operation. But if you move it back, it'll be out of the way enough. Now I'm going to slide the saw motor back, and I'm just going to have it right about here. We'll see where that is in just a minute. Now I want to lower the blade down so that way the lowest point of the blade is just below the surface of the table. Now I have this cut out right here in this table board for turning this thing completely horizontal. If you don't have that hole right there for the blade to drop down in, you're going to want to have this thing on at this time so that way you can cut a slot down into the table. You only need it to be down in the table about a 1/16 of an inch. If it's any more than 1/8 of an inch, you're really pushing it, but you got to have the lowest part of the blade below the surface of the table by a little bit, otherwise you're not going to make a full cut, you're just making an 1/8 inch wide dado. So with that down below the surface of the table, I can now go ahead and set the distance. Now I'm not setting the distance between the blade and the fence as I usually do. I'm setting the blade to front of the table distance. That's the big difference with this thing. We're referencing off the front of the table. So hopefully your table, when you made it, the front edge and the edge that the fence usually references to is parallel because you're using this as your guide. So I want to measure from one of the teeth to the front of the table. And I'm going to set this distance to be 22 inches. You can set the distance to whatever you want, but I like 22 on this saw because it gives me a lot of support on the table. The farther you can get it towards the column, the more support you're going to have because you're using more of the table. The farther it is forward, the less material you actually have on the table. So I'm just going to double check it because that 22-inch measurement is going to come in really handy in just a minute. Final thing I want to do to this is finish setting up the blade guard. I've got a scrap piece of 1/4-inch plywood right here, and I want to loosen up the wing nut that holds the guard in place and rotate the guard. So if we take a look at how the guard is set up, you'll see there's only about 1/8 of an inch of space between the top of the plywood and the bottom of the guard. You'll also notice that the teeth are going in this direction, so it's going to rotate that way. That means I need to feed the wood in this direction, opposing the rotation of the blade. And this is where people get confused because this is the exact opposite of cross-cutting on this thing. If I was to choose the wrong way to do it and I fed it in this way, so I'm pushing the wood in the direction the blade is rotating, there's a good chance it will grab the wood and try to feed itself like a wheel and launch the wood out the other side and either break something in the shop, or worse, it could suck my hand into the blade with it. So for ripping, you always feed it opposing the rotation of the blade. Now there's a downside to that, and that is if you see the blade teeth start coming out of the table where it's cutting the plywood. That means that it has the possibility to grab the workpiece and try to lift up on it. That's why the guard is down so low. It is to prevent this workpiece from lifting up. It is also there to keep sawdust out of my face, because with the blade rotating this way, it's going to be launching all the sawdust up and at an angle, and if I had the guard up where it normally is for cross-cutting, I'd be getting a face full of sawdust. There's one more thing I need to set up for this operation, and that is the anti-kickback pawls. And to do that, I just loosen up the big knob, drop them down, and I like to test them to make sure they're low enough that they actually will grab the piece of wood. Yep. If they're too low, they tend to just skate over the thing, and if they're too high, they don't grab either. So you want to just test it to make sure it truly does grab. Now we have the radial arm saw all set up. We know it's 22 inches from the front edge of the table to the blade. We've got the guard set. We've got the anti-kickback pawls set. We know which way we're feeding the wood. Now let's go actually look at the wood we're going to be cutting. I need this final dimension to be 32¼ inches wide. I know that the edge of the blade to the front edge of the table is 22 inches. So what I did is I measured back from the 32¼ inch line 22 inches, and I got this line right here. Then I drew this line parallel to the edge, because this is a factory edge and it's as straight as it's going to be. There's an issue. If I look right here, from there to the other edge, that's about 14¾ inch. Well, unless it's an optical illusion with the radial arm saw, I don't have that much space between the column and the blade. So what I need to do is cut this thing down some to begin with. In this case, what I'm going to do is give myself an extra 2 inches and just cut it with the little circular saw. Now with it trimmed down, so I've got about 1.5 inches extra to play with, I need some guide for this piece of wood because I'm not using the fence on the radial arm saw. I need something else to guide it through. Because I'm not using the fence on the radial arm saw for this cut, I need some sort of straight edge to guide this thing through. And in this case, I found a random 1x6 and I jointed one edge so that way it's straight. And what I'm going to do is clamp it 22 inches back from where I want the cut to happen, and this is now going to be my fence. You want to take your time clamping this piece of wood in place, because the more accurate you are with the placement of it on this line, the better your end result is going to be. So this should all make sense at this point. I've got the jointed 1x6 clamped to the piece of wood 22 inches away from where I want the cut to take place. So when I put this up on the table and push it through the saw, as long as I keep this board up against this front edge, I'll get a straight cut exactly where I want it to be. Let's try it out. And that's really all it takes to cut big irregular shapes on the radial arm saw. As long as you can clamp a straight edge to it a certain distance from the front edge to the blade, you can cut whatever you want because it references off that straight edge. If I want to turn this into a hexagon, if I just kept clamping that piece of wood at the correct angles and feeding this thing through, I could get a hexagon, a triangle, whatever I want with straight edges on it.